right? And I'm just gonna check to make sure on my channel that everything's working. Always double check everything.
Oh, sure. And is the sound okay?
Yep, that's the first thing I ask. I usually wait for somebody to jump in the chat and be like, "Is the sound okay?" And so it's always
Because
good to
I
have
have a
feedback.
lapel mic on.
What?
I do. I could wear a lapel mic instead of. I'm talking into my computer. It's about 2 feet away from my mouth.
Sounds fine on my end.
Okay.
Yep. So there's one person in the chat. Person in the chat. How is the sound? How is the sound? Question mark.
So we're this is live. Is that right?
Yes, it is. I posted on
Oh,
YouTube, so
I see.
it's very helpful when you can have direct feedback of like when the sound cuts out or something. Somebody can like tell you, and you can fix it and not have to like re-record.
So we're doing a live YouTube. It's the first time I've ever done that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, we've got about 6 people who just said, "Yep, sounds good." Like, great, great.
Okay.
All right, so it looks like we're live. Do you go by Jeff or Jeffrey?
Either.
All right, Jeff, it's really great to have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time to be being willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, thank you, Tom, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm a parapsychologist. I have a doctoral degree in parapsychology from the University of California at Berkeley. It happens to be the only doctoral diploma that actually says parapsychology ever awarded from an accredited university, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world. And for those of your viewers who may not know, parapsychology is the scientific study of extrasensory perception or telepathy, clairvoyance, remote viewing, psychokinesis or mind over matter, and questions relating to altered states of consciousness, life after death, reincarnation. And it also includes other areas of the paranormal, like UFOs, for example. In addition, I am the host and producer of the new Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube.
Awesome. So, how did you get into parapsychology? Like, is that something your parents taught you, or did you learn about it over time and get interested in it later in life?
Really, I had a very conventional upbringing. Parapsychology was barely on the horizon growing up in a small town in Wisconsin. Um, I started to develop an interest when I was a college student, actually. And at that time, I think I was opened up back in the 1960s by taking psychedelic drugs and practicing meditation. But I began to have a whole series of precognitive dreams that I felt, in a way, I was being guided to pursue this interest of mine. And it's I've been at it now for nearly half a century.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I'm an atheist. I'm a really hardcore naturalist, just science guy only. And for
Mhm.
me, I haven't seen any evidence for the parapsychology actually working. And so I'm curious, what was it that convinced you that all the different things you mentioned earlier are real as opposed to just imaginary?
Well, let me give you a very concrete example from my own life. I started out my graduate school career in criminology. I have a master's degree in criminology from Berkeley, and I was doing field studies at San Quentin Prison, doing group psychotherapy with murderers and rapists. And at the time, I thought to myself, I'm very interested in deviance, human deviance, but it'd be so much better to focus on the positive side of human deviance rather than the negative. And I struggled, like, how are you going to do that? At a school like Berkeley, you could study psychopathology, you could study criminology as much as you wanted. But if you wanted to study creativity, intuition, mysticism, and psychic functioning, there weren't really any outlets. And I agonized over this for months, literally. And one day, Tom, I had a feeling of certainty that I was going to find the answer to my quest in a dream. I just knew that that night the dream was going to come. And so I went to bed and I had a dream. I woke up in the morning feeling this sense of eureka. I had the answer in the dream, but I didn't know what it meant. And in my dream, I was visiting some friends who lived across town in Berkeley in married student housing. I got to their apartment, knocked on the door. Nobody was home. And in the dream, I took a key. I found their key, let myself into their apartment, walked into the living room, and there, smack dab in the middle of the living room floor, was a magazine called EYE. And in the dream, I'm paging through the magazine when I woke up. And I had this exhilarating feeling like there's the answer. So what I did is I acted out the dream. Literally, I put on my tennis shoes, ran across 5 miles across town to married student housing, got to their apartment, knocked on the door. As I had dreamt, nobody was home. I knew where they kept a key, as a matter of fact, under the doormat. I found the key, let myself in, walked into the middle of the living room, and there was a magazine right in the middle of the floor, just as I had dreamt. And this is an example of a dream distortion. It wasn't called it was called Focus. It was a magazine of listener-sponsored radio and television in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I began paging through it. And as I was looking at the magazine, it dawned on me for the very first time in my life that I could pursue my interest by getting involved in the nonprofit segment of the media, which was strange for me because at the time I was a long-haired hippie. I didn't own a radio or a television. I didn't believe in radio or television. If you had asked me in those days about electronic media, I would have said it's all phony baloney. I changed my mind at that moment and went over to KPFA in Berkeley, listener-sponsored Pacifica Radio, and said, I'd like to volunteer. And they said, okay, you can sit here at this desk, and when you hear the buzzer ring that somebody's at the front door, push this button and let them in. And even though I had my master's degree, I said, I'm happy to do that. And I did that. Within 3 weeks, I had learned about radio programming, and the program director liked it. I did a program about you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic. And the program director said, well, here, we've got this regular slot every Tuesday and Thursday at noon called The Mind's Ear, and we'd like you to host the program. So within about 3 weeks of having had that dream, I found myself sitting at a table with world-class experts. All the authors coming to the San Francisco Bay Area on their book tours would stop by to be on my program, and I had access to the very best possible resources to pursue my interests. That's what gave me the confidence then to go back to the university and create my own interdisciplinary, individual doctoral major using a procedure that was available to graduate students in good standing. So, I didn't need much more convincing than that, something's going on that cannot be accounted for by normal materialistic science.
Oh, for sure. There's lots of stuff that science can't account for. There's more we don't know than we do know, definitely. But why would you attribute that to parapsychology, or do you think, is that just saying that here is something we don't know yet, or are you actually attributing answers to it, like we can explain this in some way?
To me, it felt like guidance, Tom. I mean, why would I have known that in the middle of the living room floor in an apartment 5 miles away, there would be a magazine that would have an answer for me? That to me, that would be, minimally speaking, clairvoyance.
Clairvoyance, in what way? Because from my perspective, I've had many dreams kind of similar to that, where I have a kind of a premonition where I can see certain things in other people's houses who I know, and yeah. I can. Those are pretty common things. Like a magazine on a table isn't really spectacular. It's not like seeing.
This was not on the table. It was in the middle of the floor.
In the floor.
All by itself.
In the floor.
So the living room floor. I'm not trying to use this as an example of proof of clairvoyance. There's plenty of experimental proof for that. It's an anecdote. It has to do with my personal experience. But now that event took place 48 years ago. It changed my whole life. So, from a personal perspective, I don't need a lot of convincing, and I've had any number of other experiences of that sort personally. So. The real mystery to me isn't why these things exist. The real mystery to me is why some people feel so wedded to a strictly materialistic outlook, because the materialistic outlook is really incapable of explaining the most basic fact of your own experience, which is Descartes said, you think, therefore you exist. You're having experience.
Oh
And,
yeah,
and
I find that absolutely fascinating. And there's definitely, again, lots and lots of the materialists can't explain. But
yeah.
my biggest question is why would the alternative, a non-materialistic worldview, be able to explain that? Because for me, it
But
seems
it
like,
starts with what's real. What you know is real is your own inner experience. Everything else is actually something that you postulate.
oh, absolutely. But that doesn't tell us what that experience is. Like that experience could be a product of the brain and material, or it could be an idealistic kind of a spiritual thing, or it could be a dualistic thing where there's parts of both. But it doesn't, the fact that we have the experience doesn't tell us which one of those it is.
Well, all right. Uh, I, uh, I think when you get into metaphysical questions, the logical positivists understood correctly that that they're not necessarily resolvable. What I'm saying is it takes the fewest assumptions to start with what most immediately and most directly, which is your own consciousness.
What do you mean by the fewest assumptions?
Well, the very assumption that there is such a thing as an external world outside of your consciousness it requires something of a logical leap. It's a leap that we all make and take for granted. But if you're being strictly logical about it, you would want to apply Occam's razor and make the fewest assumptions. And the fewest assumptions would be, I am aware, I am conscious.
But wouldn't it also be an assumption to assume that my consciousness is a thing in and of itself and not a product of other things? Like it could be a composite or a material component to it. Why wouldn't assuming that it is itself fundamental, wouldn't that itself be an assumption
Well, what's your direct experience?
that I exist?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I'm not a composite. I could still be a
Well,
composite.
you may very well be a composite, but what I'm suggesting is that requires you to assume that there's something outside of your experience to begin with.
Oh, right. So, but wouldn't doesn't the same thing apply to your the perspective that I exist? Wouldn't it be an assumption to assume that I am um, like a fundamental thing? Like there isn't. I'm not a composite. To assume I'm not a composite, isn't that also an assumption?
Well, what's your experience? Do you start with your direct experience? Do you experience yourself as a composite?
Oh no.
Okay. Do you experience yourself as a unitary consciousness?
Well, not exactly. I mean, because like if I experience my house as it's not a composite, it's just my house. If I
Yeah,
take away half the house, it's not a house anymore. But the the whole can still be made of parts while itself being a whole. So my
sure.
experience of a consciousness that I am a one conscious entity doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that that consciousness isn't a result of other things interacting. So the
It, yeah. I understand where you're coming with that, and I think it could well be an open question in that regard. I'm not wedded to any particular metaphysical position on this. I think there are many viable alternatives, but I do subscribe to a philosophy that William James, the founder of American psychology, developed shortly before his death. He called it radical empiricism, which is to say the strictest form of empiricism is to take into account not just what you experience through the senses, but what you experience directly uh, when you look within yourself, when you apprehend your own consciousness immediately. That's empirical evidence.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it's kind of like on a computer screen. If I look at the computer screen, there's a single image. It's just a one image on my computer screen.
Yeah.
But would it be? Are you saying it's less of an assumption to assume that image is just its own thing, independent of any composite, and that assuming it's a composite would be a greater assumption than just assuming that the screen is a thing in and of itself?
Yes, I would say that. You're making a logical assumption to assume that an external world, independent of your consciousness, exists at all. Now, we all make that assumption. It's a good working assumption, but from a strictly logical point of view, it may be an unnecessary assumption.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. I didn't explain that clearly. So if we look at the screen, let's just assume there is an external world for now, and we
Okay.
we see a screen like a TV screen in front of us or a computer screen in your case. There's two possibilities. Maybe the computer is itself just a fundamental thing. It's just one thing,
Yeah.
or maybe it's a composite of lots of other things. And you're saying that it's less of an assumption to assume that the computer screen we're seeing in front of us is just one thing, as opposed to it being a composite of other things.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't really endeavoring to address that question at all. That's a separate issue, and yeah, I haven't, to be honest, haven't given that any thought. Whether something is a unitary thing or a composite, how many assumptions are involved. I'm talking about what you gathered that I was saying originally, that the existence of an external world requires a logical assumption.
Oh, absolutely. But from my perspective, when I think about my consciousness, it's like thinking about the computer screen. We have this
Yeah.
experience of this thing, but
Mm-hmm.
why would that be less of an assumption to assume that that thing, whether it be consciousness or a laptop, is a fundamental unitary thing as opposed to a composite thing? Because to me, when you look at the two questions, they seem equivalent. I can't really say one way or the other which one is less.
I would have to agree with you about that.
Oh, cool.
Uh, yeah, I wouldn't disagree necessarily. In fact, William James, who I admire greatly, wrote a book called "The Pluralistic Universe," in which he suggested that uh, it's he rejected the Hindu Vedantic idea of the one consciousness embracing everything. He said no, there's a multiplicity. So even looking internally, yeah, one can question whether our consciousness is part of a one great cosmic mind, or whether uh, it's just multi.
Lots of different consciousnesses working together.
Yeah, I want to say a word like multipliferous.
Multiplicity, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you were asking, if I understood the drift of what you're trying to get at, is there good scientific evidence for the existence of parapsychological phenomena? Isn't that where you were trying to elucidate?
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely one of the questions I had.
Yeah, uh, because I think these days one of the best answers that I can give in that regard is to look at the pretty sure it's the August 2018 issue of the American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, an association that has no love for parapsychology, rarely ever publishes anything of a parapsychological nature. And in my experience, psychologists are amongst the most hostile and even threatened by the existence of parapsychology because, the pecking order of science, psychology is sort of near the bottom of the pecking order, and they
Yeah.
don't like to be associated with something as fringe and so far out of the mainstream as parapsychology. But they ended up publishing this article written by my friend Etzel Cardania at Lund University in Sweden. It is a review of meta-analyses covering over 1,400 different experiments in parapsychology, showing that overall the statistical evidence is overwhelmingly positive, and that the quality of the data does not decline with regard to the quality of the research itself, and goes on to point out that there are many interesting hypotheses proposed within the field of quantum physics and elsewhere that might account for this phenomenon. So I think as a result of that, one would have to say that mainstream psychology has now put a marker down saying that, yeah, we have to consider this as real and valid based on 1,400 or more different empirical studies that have been published in the scientific literature.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that scientific studies are great evidence. So could you give me a few examples? Like when we talk about parapsychology, are there things that we can specifically do with parapsychology to control it? Or is it kind of random and uncontrollable, kind of like a miracle in the religious circles?
Well, religious miracles are of great interest to parapsychologists. And I usually compare it to baseball. Uh, Babe Ruth was one of the greatest players of all time, great home run hitter. He struck out far more often than he hit home runs. But he was still considered a great baseball player. And I think parapsychology research is like that. You have to look at it as a probabilistic phenomenon. So there are some great, you could call them psychics or remote viewers or percipients. There are different words in the literature for these individuals. There are some really good ones, and I've seen many, many amazing hits. But if you look at their overall track record, it's kind of like Babe Ruth. There'll be plenty of strikeouts, and people who are inclined to be skeptical will say, well, look at, here's an example. Uri Geller. Let's take Uri Geller. He was on the Johnny Carson show when Johnny Carson asked him to do some things and he failed to do it. So does that mean that the whole field is fraudulent? Well, of course not.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember that. That was the James Randi thing. It was a really interesting documentary to watch. But
Yeah.
from my perspective, even if we accept that it works at only a baseball level degree of accuracy,
Yeah.
that is still high enough that it would be able to make a pretty significant impact economically, like if it was real from my perspective. So like anytime in history when we have a discovery, like guns, for example, guns when we first invented them, they were terrible. They had horrible accuracy. They worked less than Babe Ruth's accuracy, but they were good enough to give you an edge over the competition where like governments and countries could then conquer everybody and just roll over everything in the world. Or nuclear weapons, the same kind of thing. We never used them. We use them less often than Babe Ruth, thankfully, but they make a world-changing impact economically. When we have new economic discoveries like Amazon or Apple or Microsoft, even if they're terrible, like our old computers were just awful and Pong was just the basic thing we could do, but they made a huge economic impact. So if parapsychology was real from my perspective, then you would be able to make this kind of an economic impact to be able to change things. Or, for example, governments would definitely be pouring in billions and billions of dollars into this to be able to try and influence or to win or to conquer or to build economies or whatever. Like the government invests billions into particle colliders like the Large Hadron Collider, which does essentially nothing but smash particles together when we can't use for anything yet. So why isn't that happening with parapsychology? Why don't we see these kind of massive economic shifts that we do with any other kind of technological discovery?
Well, I think part of the reason is because we're talking about the human consciousness itself. And it's not like something external to us like a gun, which is strictly mechanical. Let me give you an example. Hal Puthoff, who was one of the pioneer physicists working at the Stanford Research Institute, pioneering remote viewing studies, had his children were in a private school, and the school needed to raise $30,000. It was a Waldorf school, as I recall, and so he used remote viewing to predict the silver futures market and raise $30,000 for the school. But he realized that he stopped once he achieved his goal of raising that much money for the school. He didn't pursue it anymore because in the financial forecasting area, which it happens to be a big interest of mine, what you find is that when you start to do extremely well, you get emotionally aroused. Keith,
Overconfident.
well, yeah, Keith Harari, for example, did one of these studies uh, forecasting silver futures. It got written up in the Wall Street Journal back in the 1980s. He had 9 hits in a row forecasting silver futures, made a couple $100,000 for his investor in that experiment. And then he said, I began to feel like the goose that laid the golden egg. And as I'm a trader myself. I know, when you get a really good trade or a series of good trades, you feel like God or something. And then when you have a bad one, you feel terrible. Your emotions go on a roller coaster. And it's exactly that kind of emotional roller coaster which interferes with good psychic functioning. So to use precognition as a form of financial forecasting is very difficult to do for that reason.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say, but I don't see a difference between that and other kinds of business models because most business models in economics are just about people. They're just about how people relate, like multi-level marketing or pyramid schemes. Um, we know Bernie Madoff made a lot of money um, ripping people off by using these kinds of schemes because we know they work and they're all psychological. It's all just about how people's minds work. So if you have a way to interact with people's minds in that emotional way, it seems like you would be able to essentially conquer the market, even if it only works at a smaller rate, even if it's only a partial success, even if you get overconfident at times and fail. That happens in economics all the time, and just investors who think they can just predict it just based off of whatever algorithm they're using, they can become overconfident. But their algorithms still work. They still make billions and billions of dollars, and lots of people use these in markets. They didn't just stop because they could be overconfident or because they have a low success rate. Because marketing algorithms work even less than Babe Ruth. They're like at a 50-50 at best for just losing all your money. So we know that the current economic things that we use are even worse than Babe Ruth. So if
Well, most traders lose money.
yeah, for sure.
So it's not very easy. But I can say that since the government closed the Stargate program, I think it closed in 1996. I'm talking about a remote viewing project that was sponsored by the U.S. federal government and ran for 20 years. And produced quite a number of successes. The archives of that material is now publicly available. And there are 4 published volumes reviewing it. But since that time, there's been a cottage industry that has grown up of people who were initially trained by the military and now have their own little small businesses where they train other people. And they often do consulting work for police. They work on lost children cases. They do some financial forecasting work. They do archaeological work. There's, I wouldn't call it a massive industrial uh, effort yet. Maybe in 100 years it'll reach that level, but it's a cottage industry, and there are any number of successes that people point to.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not sure how you feel about dowsing. I don't think dowsing works as a thing, but I know there are certain kinds of older sciences that, like, forget what it was, the one that heat created a new particle and causes things to rise. Phlogiston. So phlogiston can make predictions that have successful things, but then later we discovered it didn't work. And so
Yeah.
there are lots of different kinds of scientific endeavors that do have some limited success, but when you try to apply them, they don't work to really produce any kinds of effects. And for me, it seems like parapsychology is the same kind of a thing, where it's you can produce some effects, but when it's really invested, it doesn't really seem to have the level of success that we would expect from something that was a significant find, kind of like a gun or a technological thing or multi-level marketing strategies or economic uh, equations or whatever. All of those things seem to be worth investing in, which is why it seems to me like the government stopped investing in parapsychology because it just didn't really bear any fruits as opposed to like particle collision, which really doesn't do anything, but it actually has some observable demonstrable effects reliably. So
Well,
from
yeah, I don't think that's really quite an applicable argument because you have to take into account various social prejudices that also exist. You have to take into account, for example, that a huge segment of the population, people who regard themselves as fundamentalist, evangelical people, regard parapsychology as the work of the devil. And then you have another large segment of the population, people who think of themselves as scientific materialists, who regard parapsychology as their equivalent of the work of the devil, but they would refer to it as the rising tide of superstition.
yeah,
So those are social forces that make it very difficult for any large organization to actively engage in a funding program. I mean, why is it that uh, 40 years after I got my doctoral diploma in parapsychology, none have been issued?
well,
So
you actually created that program, right?
I created it, yeah. But we're talking about a viable scientific field. The Parapsychological Association is an affiliate of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. There have been scientific journals in this field published since 1882 continuously. Uh, and yet, large organizations like universities are very, very hesitant to touch it because of the social stigma. So that is really holding things back to a large degree. However, let me also add that there are other fields for which we've had very high expectations that didn't materialize immediately either. Fusion energy. The government put billions of dollars into fusion energy. We have yet to make it work, although I remember when I was an undergraduate, people said it's just around the corner. So my attitude is, with regard to parapsychology, the data is clear. It's been accepted now by the American Psychological Association. And the practical applications, if you look, you will see them on a small scale. And maybe over time, social conditions will change and we'll see it on a large scale. I know in my own YouTube channel, many viewers are horrified by the idea that, given our current social climate, large-scale applications of parapsychology would occur because they're concerned about various elite organizations controlling this sort of thing to the detriment of the whole population. And so maybe, given the state of humanity as a whole, we're making a big mess of the planet as it is. It's better that we don't rush into the development of large-scale parapsychology projects.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's lots of social stigma around many things. I mean, it used to be the fact that the religious people thought that science was in fact work of the devil, and they burned Bruno Giuliano at the stake because he said that the world went around the sun, not the other way around. And Galileo was put into house arrest, and Boltzmann was actually ostracized, thrown out of his job, committed suicide because he said that things were made of atoms. But all of those things were able to be confirmed. Like, it didn't matter how much ostracization there was, they worked. And the fact that they worked meant that they took over. And every single case of that happening, like even in the scientific community, they criticized Einstein for saying that his idea of space-time bending was just absolutely crazy because time isn't a physical concept. It can't bend. That doesn't make any sense. So they just dismissed him completely. And it took 6 months for his paper to be published. But then after that, it just took over the world. It made one testable prediction that was verified by anybody who could find it. And It just took over the world. So it seems that social ostracization can't really do much to stop anything that works. Like, if it works, it's going to conquer the world no matter what. There's essentially no way to stop it unless you just kill everybody who believes in it. So I don't know if the social stigma argument is really compelling for me, because everything we've ever had a social stigma for, if it worked, it won, no matter how much of the stigma existed. I definitely agree that there are certain things that we expect to work, like fusion, which we actually have more recently. We're developing two fusion reactors in the UK right now, so we've got it to work, but it's just recently. But
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
yeah,
How are they containing it?
they're using a plasma shield, so they're taking they're taking particles, heating them up to the point where the electrons break off, and it can create a plasma shield to be able to maintain the field temperatures required to do it. They actually did it. They created a smaller version. I think it's Stanford, and they had it running in the 80s. It just couldn't create a positive amount of energy, a positive net energy. So these two new ones in the UK are big enough to do that. So we just made huge discoveries in that field, which are really exciting. As long as the world doesn't blow up before then. But yeah,
Yeah.
but
Well, let me go deeper with you then, because I think there are other real psychological reasons why this development of parapsychology is going to be much slower. I do think it's happening. I think that the social conditions are changing. I mean, for example, on my YouTube channel, we have 72,000 subscribers. People are interested in a serious intellectual discussion of this area.
oh yeah, that's why I invited you on. I'm interested in this topic.
But consider this. I don't know how you feel about Sigmund Freud, but Freud, I thought, made a very good point when he identified unconscious processes. And he pointed out that we don't want to know what's going on in our own mind. That's why we have psychological defense mechanisms and repression of our own thoughts. And because we don't want to know what's going on in our own mind, generally because many of our own thoughts are not socially acceptable, we don't want other people to know what's going on in our own mind. So telepathy, the very idea of telepathy, is threatening to people, threatening to everybody. If you don't want to know about yourself, you surely don't want other people to be able to see things about you that you don't even want to see. And so I think a lot of the antagonism toward parapsychology is, in effect, a psychological defense mechanism that is normal for people to protect themselves from this awareness of what's going on inside of us.
But why would that hold back the research? Because if one person does it, like Einstein discovering time bending, or one person inventing a gun, or one person inventing a multi-level marketing scheme, they're going to be able to make a lot of an impact.
I don't know why you keep bringing up multi-level marketing schemes.
Oh, well, it's a psychological process because it's not actually something in the world. You mentioned that you didn't like my examples of a gun because it's something in the world, not about the mind, and that parapsychology is more about the mind. And multi-level marketing schemes are just about manipulating human thought processes to make money, essentially. So it is just about the mind. That's why I use that one.
All right. I think I know where you're going with that. I think what you mean is what Bernie Madoff was doing.
In a sense, yeah. So people can manipulate other people's thought patterns to
I
make
mean,
lots of money.
marketing is a little different. That's like a company like Amway or something.
Yeah, it's essentially a kind of a pyramid scheme, a little bit. So it's using, if we'll sell you the product, and you can then be a seller to sell other people the product, and then they can be sellers to make other sellers the product. And it's a
Right.
good psychological way to get people involved to make lots of money for the people at the top, but it doesn't do really well for the people at the bottom. So
Well, it works. It works on taking the principle of greed and fear and applying it. And with parapsychology, what you need to do is eliminate those emotions of greed and fear. For example, the classical literature of yoga says if you meditate and you calm your mind, then your mind will reflect reality perfectly, like the surface of a clear lake on a quiet day reflects the environment around it. And of course, all these ancient traditions of yoga and Buddhism and shamanism and so on speak of the psychic functioning as being a natural and normal experience for people who are able to quiet their minds.
oh yeah, I totally agree that the applied methodology of parapsychology is much harder than essentially manipulating people and taking advantage of their emotional proclivities. But I would still say that even as hard as it is, if you
Mhm.
could do it reliably, I think it would still have some really big demonstrable impact. I don't understand why it doesn't. That's my thing is like, because even if we had like a group of 10 people, say, who could, I remember you had on a few weeks ago, I forgot her name, but she said she had a group of people who she tested beforehand to make sure that they could, that it wasn't just an imaginary thing. And she said she waited until they had like an 80% success rate to be able to do kind of
Rory Williams.
yes, yes.
Uh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, but if we just took her group and assumed that they did were able to have that level of success at certain kinds of things, and they could essentially discover or do remote viewing of certain areas to find like any discover just any ship or something that we have lost,
Uh-huh.
and with like treasure buried treasure on it or whatever, they could make huge impacts in history and psychology and in neurology, like everything. They could just revolutionize the field, regardless of how many people disavow them. So why is the disavowment stopping them from being able to make the progress that they would?
Uh, I thought when I entered this field back in the 1970s that it was going to be revolutionary, just like that we were on the brink of enormous social changes. I've come to appreciate it's not going to work that way. It's going to take much longer. It may happen in 1,000 years. I don't know. But um, I do know my friend Jacques Vallée, who was a computer scientist and also a UFO researcher, remembers that time too, because he was one of the people working on the internet in the pioneering days. And he said, this has the same potential to revolutionize society as parapsychology. And we can look back now and say, yeah, the internet really did revolutionize psychology, and parapsychology, for all of its potential, has yet to do so. So, uh, I understand your skepticism, and it's very frustrating for some of us because things haven't happened faster. But when we're talking about human nature itself, human nature can change only very, very slowly. And for the most part, when you look at the world around you, our political leaders, for example, what you see is a lot of primate behavior, aggressive behavior, sort of dominating what's happening in the world today, and uh, the the kind of mindset that is required for really the long term application and integration of parapsychology into our culture is very different from the kind of mindset that is currently at work in the world. So I'm happy that I can tell you, that there are small advances that are taking place, like the article in American Psychologist or the various applied remote viewing projects that the government engaged in, and that people like Lori Williams and Stephen Schwartz and Lynn Buchanan and many of the other people I interview on New Thinking Aloud are actually doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that you're totally right about human nature taking a long time to change, but I don't see why human nature is relevant at all. I don't think it needs to change. I think that, like,
Yeah.
with every other discovery, you make one change. Only one person needs to be able to do it, and then they get an advantage. Kind of like evolution. You have mutation, and then that one new species just rises to the top and conquers everybody. That seems to be the commonality among technology and any work in psychology that can make an impact economically, or anything that can like evolutionary change. It's always that one person who does it, regardless of if anybody else changes, that one person who does it just conquers the world
Yeah.
essentially. But
Well, apparently, what's going on in parapsychology is not quite conforming to that model. There are many science fiction stories, though, that talk about what would it be like if that happened, if some very powerful psychic were to take over the world, and usually those stories are quite dystopian. So I'm not sure that that would be a good idea at all. I'll give you another example. Back in the 1970s, there was a physicist named William Wolkowski who worked at the Henri Poincaré Institute in Paris. And he was doing research on genetic modification using a talented psychokinetic subject in France named Jean Pierre Girard. And he got successful uh, findings. They were working on modifying the genetic frequency within fruit flies, which are very well known, of course.
Hmm.
And so when he discovered that this psychic was able to influence the genetics of fruit flies using ostensibly psychokinesis, he shut the whole project down because he said, this is not good. Humanity is not ready for this. We shouldn't move in this direction. And I compliment him for doing that. I think that was a very wise move, that, to rush forward with some kind of powerful psychic technology. I don't think it would be good. I think many spiritual teachers suggest, for example, that we have to take Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian mystic, put it this way. He said, take 2 steps towards ethics before you take 1 step towards power. And I think that's very good advice for humanity at this point. We have far too much power and not enough ethics.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that the world would definitely be better off if people did that. But for example, the same thing that you mentioned with the genetic modification happened in the scientific community recently with the CRISPR-Cas9, which is a virus kind of a thing, which we can go send it into the DNA, remove a segment, and then replace it with anything we want, essentially.
Yeah,
And we can play God essentially with DNA. And a lot
yeah,
of people, especially in the Western countries, have placed limitations on what we can do. We can't do this with any kind of embryos or reproductive cells because it would just be the consequences are very terrifying.
yeah,
But places like China don't care at all. They're just like, nope, we're going to test everything we can to see it could work. And
yeah,
they have made significant discoveries that we have actually utilized here in the Western world, even with their less than moral practices. And so
mhm,
it seems like even though there are definitely people who put on that moral barrier to stop themselves from exploring, it only takes one person to say, nope, we're not going to do this, we're going to be immoral, and they make the advancements. So
yeah.
why hasn't someone else like the Chinese government who also do experiments with parapsychology, why haven't they picked up his work and taken over it and started to make those kinds of modifications with the genetic things?
Well, I have amongst the viewers on my YouTube channel people who are really into conspiracy theories, and some of them believe that this actually is happening, and they keep it secret. They don't want us to know that there are, the Illuminati or whoever, great powerful psychics are controlling the world, and we are all at their mercy right now, and things are working out just the way they want it, and we're helpless. I don't buy into that, frankly, but uh, if it were the case, how would we know otherwise?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We definitely wouldn't. But from my perspective, that if parapsychology was real, then I think that discoveries in the field would be progressive, little increments at a time, kind of like our progress in genetics. So they wouldn't be able to essentially just take over the world and at the point where no one would notice, because they wouldn't be able to make that big of a progress that fast. They'd still have to start small and build their way up. And so we
Well,
notice something.
you have to take into account that although parapsychology as a scientific discipline really goes back to 1882, people who are exploring psychic powers, you can find that in the most ancient of cultures, in shamanistic societies 10,000 years ago. So uh, it's not as if parapsychologists are necessarily the most advanced or knowledgeable people, even with regard to the very subject matter that we study.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the big challenges for me is that parapsychology has been researched throughout all time, throughout all human history and all human cultures, but it hasn't seemed to produce the kinds of results that anything else has.
Well, I guess you have to look and see what's there, and it is what it is. It may not conform to your expectations. It didn't conform to my expectations, but uh, the data speaks for itself.
Well, from my perspective, like how would you tell the difference between parapsychology and opposed to like homeopathy? Because homeopathy has effects, but we then discovered that those effects are usually placebo kinds of effects. And that I'm not sure what your position is on homeopathy. My position is that it's been demonstrated to not be effective as opposed to like a placebo effect. And so those kinds of things, which are heavily popular, how would you tell the difference between parapsychology, which you say does work and does have scientific papers backing it up, and homeopathy, which is the same kind of thing, which had many scientific papers backing it up until it was essentially disproven in many cases.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in homeopathy, but I do know that my friend Brian Josephson, who is a Nobel laureate in physics, takes a deep interest in it in terms of what he would describe as the memory in water. That there's a researcher in France, I think, Benveniste, who has done quite a few studies on this idea that water itself has properties akin to what we would think of as memory. So I don't close the door on homeopathy. As for the placebo effect, that's very interesting. It seems to be one of the strongest effects in all of medicine, actually. Uh, so I think what the placebo effect speaks to is what some people now call mind body medicine, that there's an enormous psychological component to whether people get well or not. And there is, for example, a body of literature in the field of psychic healing using triple blind experiments with psychic healers working on people compared to a control group. And where I think they endeavor in those studies to compare the healing effects with a placebo effect. Uh, and I'm pretty sure that many of those studies suggest that actually distant healing shows a measurable statistical effect over and above the placebo effect. But it's very tricky. People often will say, how do you know, for example, that it's really the experimental group that got better rather than the control group that got worse?
Oh yeah, I mean, I would hold it to the same standard as any scientific study. If it can get better than the p-values, that's evidence. So I would
Yeah.
definitely count that for sure. From the placebo effect, yeah, you're right that the mind-body connection is one of the most powerful things in healing because if your stress level and cortisol level goes up, your immune system shuts down, and so you'd actually need to be more relaxed to heal at all. And that is essentially the work I've researched on the placebo effect is that it is related to cortisol and shutting down the immune system. That when you do relax and start to believe you will get better, you actually your immune system starts to heat up and heal you more at that point. So I definitely think that. But my question initially was, how would you tell the difference between parapsychology, which could potentially make a huge impact on society, and some other thing that doesn't work for certain, and it could have a huge impact on society, and it definitely gets some levels of successful results. How do you tell the difference between these two?
Well, obviously, the best way is through carefully designed research studies, but even they have limits because as soon as you accept the premise that something like telepathy is real, then you have to look at how researchers, not just in parapsychology, but in every other field, might be using their own telepathy or psychokinesis to influence the studies that they're engaged in order to achieve a cherished result. I think it's one of the reasons why psychologists and other people in the behavioral sciences have for so long been very hesitant to embrace parapsychology because it would call into question many of their own findings. And we're at a point in history, I think that many of the findings of behavioral science are, in fact, being called into question. Things that have been accepted for decades, we now are discovering, well, they don't really replicate so well. So there's a huge uproar in sociology and economics and all of the what you might call the behavioral or the social sciences for this very reason.
Oh yeah, that was a big thing in science recently. The problem of reproducibility in the soft sciences, for
Yeah,
sure. Um, but how you mentioned how if telepathy was real, how the researchers could influence their own study. Do you mean unconsciously, without realizing they're doing telepathy, doing it to cause an influence on the study?
sure. Absolutely. Researcher. Well, we do know this. There has been some studies on what we call the psi conducive researcher. There are researchers who just seem to be natural, and most of their studies turn out to be highly significant. There are other researchers who have the opposite point of view. There's a fellow who got a doctoral degree in a parapsychological topic, Richard Wiseman in England, who is now a prominent person, mostly in the skeptical camp himself. And he once invited a good friend of mine, Marilyn Schlitz, who was a very talented researcher, to conduct a study in his lab using the protocols that he set up that wouldn't work for him at all. And what he had to report was that when Marilyn did the same study in his lab, she got positive results. He was very reluctant to report it because he was a skeptic, but nevertheless he did, and it suggests that there's real individual differences. Some people, for whatever reason, have more of a natural talent for psychic functioning. Not so surprising, really. You'd find the same thing with musical ability or mathematical or artistic ability. But what it means is that when you're doing a research study, trying to understand the process by which psychic functioning works rather than simply the magnitude of the functioning, you can never be sure that the researcher isn't using some form of psychic ability to get results that conform with their own cherished hypothesis. And this is probably something, if psychic functioning is real, it's something that would affect many, many different fields of science. There's even quite a bit of research looking at psychic functioning, psychic influences on quantum mechanical random event generators, suggesting that, hardware can be influenced by psychic functioning. So that would have ramifications for fields like particle physics, even. It's one of the reasons, I think, why there's so much resistance to parapsychology, because if you begin to take these findings seriously, you've got to call into question an awful lot of research that we now take for granted.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's why people were so opposed to Einstein's research, because it put into question Newtonian mechanics. But from my perspective, like you said, you can't tell the difference if there are telepathic effects. They could go back and affect the effects of the study. Well, couldn't you just make the study external, like, for example, predicting the stock markets or whatever? Those kinds of things. How could those kinds of studies be influenced by the telepathy of the researchers?
Well, the theory is that a parapsychology experiment is affected by everybody who is aware of that experiment. And that would include the researchers. It would include the participants in the study. It could even include people who read about it in the future. There's the whole question of what's sometimes called retrocognitive psychokinesis. In other words, researchers have looked at, can you influence an event in the past using psychokinesis? And it gets very tricky to interpret that data because what they've come up with is the idea that, yes, you can influence events in the past as long as nobody knows about them until the present. If they were known in the past, then they can't be influenced. But if you have, for example, you create a random
do you mean no one knows about the event you're influencing, or no one knows that you're trying to influence it?
Nobody knows nobody has witnessed the target until the present.
Okay. So like does that mean?
These are that were done by a physicist named Helmut Schmidt. And here's what he did. He used a quantum mechanical random event generator to generate a series of random targets. Those targets were stored in some form of magnetic storage. And he took that magnetic storage and gave it to who he considered a skeptic. But that person didn't read it, so nobody read what the targets were. Then long after the targets had been created, he would have a research subject attempt to exert a psychokinetic influence retrocognitively on the random event process that created those targets at some moment in the past. Then, when the person had done so, and there would be a direction, like the instruction was make the targets more go to the right than to the left, or more up than down, or a binary target would have more of one direction than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Then after that had been done, he has the skeptical party open up the sealed container, usually magnetic storage, that show the actual target sequence. And it seemed to show statistically that the person was exhibiting a retrocognitive psychokinetic influence, since the targets, presumably the influence was on the random process that generated the targets and not on the magnetic storage that contained that information.
So you mentioned that if you can retrodict affect things in the past, does that
Yeah.
mean that if lots of parapsychologists who believe in parapsychology believe in a study, it's more likely to be positive results than if lots of skeptics do a study and they are more likely to have negative results?
You know, that seems to be the case. One of the strongest findings in parapsychology has been called the sheep goat effect, which shows that people who are confident that this is real tend to get better results. People who are confident that it's not real seem to get results that conform to their expectation.
But you mentioned you could do that to the things in the past. So if parapsychology was actually confirmed in the future, and many people accepted it like they accept science today, then wouldn't all of them knowing about the studies today make it more likely that they would all succeed?
Well, as I mentioned, that retrocognitive psychokinetic experiment will work as long as the target sequence is only observed after the attempt to influence it. If somebody were to open up the target sequence and observe it prior to that time, it doesn't seem to work.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it seems to be, at least the thinking is, and I have to tell you, I have a lot of questions about it. I don't accept the retrocognitive psychokinetic hypothesis at face value necessarily, but Helmut Schmidt, who's now deceased, but who developed that line of research, seemed to feel that you could influence the past as long as nobody knew what the past target was until after the influence effort had taken place.
Yeah, I actually remember I watched I think it was your last episode where you had a guy talking about time travel warfare and how the Nazis were researching if you could go back in time and influence things, you would essentially be able to conquer the world. I forget the Latin terms he used, where it was like chrono something or another. That was just the most powerful tool that you could do. I mean, it seems like if that was ever discovered, like in the future, we would start to see pretty big changes even in the present. Like it seems very strange the way things turned out if you could actually change things in the future. Like, I don't think Donald Trump would be president if we could actually change things in the future.
Well, who knows? Maybe there were people who were using their psychic abilities to engineer that, or things that seem to come out of nowhere that happen.
Some evil parapsychologists in the future just wanted to torment us, so they made Trump president.
Well, I did a program on this with a fellow named Gary Lockman, who has written a book about people who practice what they call chaos magic, who were attempting to use that protocol to manipulate Trump's election. Yes. And who take credit for it, as a matter of fact.
So is there anything that would disprove parapsychology? How would you falsify it?
That's a real bugaboo for skeptics in particular. I did interview a famous skeptic, James Alcock, and he was just so frustrated that it seemed as if, how can you prove a negative? Mm-hmm. In other words, how can you prove that something doesn't exist?
Yep.
It's hard. I mean, in parapsychology, what we endeavor to do is disprove the null hypothesis. And that you disprove the null hypothesis when you get statistically significant results, which has happened, over and over and over and over and over again in parapsychology. So the burden for a skeptic at this point if they're to take the evidence at face value, well, in fact, James Alcock, who I interviewed, basically wrote a rebuttal to the article that I mentioned to you that appeared in the American Psychologist. And his only rebuttal is, and I think from the point of view of philosophy of science, it's a very weak rebuttal. He said, I don't care how strong the data is, this is impossible.
Yeah, that's a terrible, terrible response. You should never ever say that in science. Because I would actually be, I would like it if parapsychology was true. I think that would be really cool. I would be fascinated by it. I would be researching it all the time for me because I think the ability to influence, especially people, is a really cool thing. And so I would not want to reject it at all. But when I ask like how would you falsify it, from my perspective, it's not asking like prove a negative. You of course you can never do that. My question would be like, what could we discover to show that the particular effect isn't there? Like not that it doesn't exist at all, but how can we do a test to fail or show that like one particular aspect of parapsychology isn't working?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't have an answer for you. If, for example, let's take the 1,400 published studies, if those results had conformed to chance expectation, I think parapsychology wouldn't exist as a field. But the truth of the matter is that the data has been consistent over the years. So if you look back and say that would have been a disproof if parapsychologists never got data above statistical expectation.
Do you remember the name of the paper?
Um, I I think it was, if you give me a minute, I could call it up. I could even put it on the screen here if you do screen sharing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Could you do that? I just definitely want to find the names. I'm going to put that in the description because I definitely want to look at it. I haven't seen it before.
All right. You want me to do that right now?
Sure. Yeah. If you have time, definitely.
Yeah. Let's see if I can call it up. Hold on here. Okay, I have it on my screen. The title of the paper is Experimental Evidence for Parapsychological Phenomena, a Review.
Awesome. Thanks. I will put that in the description. Great. Yeah, I'm definitely going to check that out, and I will for sure get back to you on my response to it. We've been going for about an hour now, so that's about my normal scheduled time. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise. Happy to do it anytime, Tom.
Awesome. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.